Yeah, thanks very much. I was thinking we could switch gears a little bit and just talk about the kind of broader meaning of iconography in the sense of the church and the soul. And I was thinking of your article, Aesthetics of Deification. Um, in that article, you speak of the monastic as himself an iconographer. And specifically, you have a quote, which I'm going to read, which describes monasticism as, quote, the philosophical life through which, in cooperation with divine energy, the monk depicts within himself the divine likeness with the vivid colors of the virtues, end quote. So kind of switching gears a little bit, I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on the connection between, for example, the vivid colors of this icon and this idea of depicting within the soul the vivid colors of the virtues, and kind of talk a little bit about that connection.
Yeah, I think, that statement is pretty much based on Diodocus Fotiki, I think, that I quote a few times. And that section is called the Iconography of the Soul. And he has this idea of the divine image being like the drawing, getting back to the drawing. And it is what has been given, so to speak. And then, but you have to color it in by emulating, what the Lord, set as a standard of life, and the commandments that he put in place as the ladder, so to speak, for us to climb towards deification. And so the virtues then become the gradual filling in of the drawing with the colors. And the Doko says that you don't really get to the final details, it's not complete until you have actually attained unto love. And that is the big challenge, I mean, you could sometimes, have all the colors you think you want in there, but they're not working together because you're not making them cohere or harmonize with the main component, which is genuine love. There are different ways that iconographers have throughout the recent years, especially since the revival in the 20th century, interpreted the various forms of the icon, the aesthetic components, the elongation, the lack of naturalism, which at times it could get a little bit too rigid, one-to-one kind of interpretations that are, people tend to dogmatize on them. But there is one interpretive component that I think is interesting, is the highlights, at the very end, they're sometimes referred to as enliveners, right? And they bring everything together in the icon. They make everything just pop, and everything comes into the right focus and definition with those final highlights. And similarly, you could have all the colors, or you could think that you are working on your soul, but meanwhile you're forgetting the love component, and then it's just not working. And so but I think of course, which goes in my mind, I think there is a passage in Saint Dionysius where he described the ecclesial hierarchy as I think the priest is what is it, illumination, purgation, and union, right? So the or theosis, the bishop iconizes theosis, the deacon purgation, and I think the priest illumination, or something like that. And I think there's a truth to that, of course, but there is a danger of seeing these components as too rigid, where you forget about the how all these things work together in our personal lives in a continuum. And one day you could be actually bringing all these components together in a way that it's you're rendering yourself in whatever tier of the hierarchy you are, like it's rendering yourself translucent to the efficacy of things working just right. Or you could just stultify it by just like not getting it right. You know, by falling back into sin, or like, you know, or being negligent in some one way or another. And similarly, you could get a little bit too, you got to be careful with getting too rigid about the analogy that St. Diodocus Photiki expresses. But I think because the love component has to be there through and through. So in the icon, for example, there's always light coming through because the gessoed board, right? So the gesso board is important. You can't apply the colors too flat, because then you'll deaden the actual transference of like the light bouncing from the board back to the eye. So there is both the highlight at the end and the light that is always interacting with everything else throughout the whole process of painting. And similarly with the coloring in of, you know, the virtues on the line, you have to also remember that, yes, you know, like perfect love is like the ideal that we all aim towards, because ultimately God is love. And so given that he's uncontainable, we will always be aspiring more and more towards like higher and higher levels of our attainment of love. So it's not like you reach an end. So, but even throughout all the process, you have to always imbue all the practices of the virtues with the light of love. So, but I think it's a wonderful analogy, and I think that's why I used it, because one of the reasons being that there is a tendency for a person like me, a painter, to overdo the aesthetic dimension in the classic sense of like that which you perceive by the senses, right? And you forget about the higher beauty, and so there is also a danger in the contemporary rhetoric towards beauty, because there is, like, for example, a common thing people say, beauty will save the world, right? And so derived from Dostoevsky, right? So which is true, but like, what beauty are we talking about, right? And so because there is also an ambiguous component to beauty, because, you know, Eve beheld the fruit and it pleased her eyes, right? And so I think it was Baudelaire who did a piece in his Flowers of Evil, where he talks about beauty as exactly that kind of ambiguity, where like he says, like, I don't know if it's from hell or if it's from heaven, you know, because there is a dimension of aesthetic sensible appearances that like you could get trapped into, and you don't anagogically transcend. And so that piece was sort of like in grappling with, let's look at the higher aesthetics, not just the sensible aesthetics, like post-Kantian, you know, 18th century, you know, the discipline of aesthetics as invented, you know, in the modern age, you know. So
great, thank you. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting how you were talking about how love kind of unites all the various virtues. And I think that might come through in your description of icons as a kind of, I think you say, a nuptial embrace between the creator and the creation. So I think that kind of gets at that idea of love.
And that gets back to the whole Dionysian notion of theophany, right? And you know, and all the various images in scripture about the union of man and God as a nuptial union. And ultimately, man as microcosm and mediator brings the totality of nature, cosmos, with him in that process of deification. And so so yeah, the whole and which is basically the fulfillment of what has always been intended. And because nature itself is it's already participating in divinity, but you know, we have somehow broken, we've thrown a wrench into that life, and so the Lord came to restore it, but the incarnation was intended regardless. We messed up the situation. And so nature is an incarnation prior to the incarnation, right? So it's the theophany, right? And so we are, insofar as we participate in him, you know, in him we move and live and have our being, right? And so, you know, which goes back to the Areopagus, right? And so that's the total Dionysian understanding. And so it's coming to a knowledge of that in a participatory level, you know, that's the gnosis that will actually actualize the nuptial union that was intended from the very beginning.
It sounds like the hypostasis, or the human person as a microcosm, is central to sort of avoiding this negative kind of beauty. But before I could go on, I want to ask Sam, maybe if he has any questions that he would like to ask. I know we're, you know, we've already been going for about 50 minutes. So do you think...
I'm open. So if you're open, I'm open. The next thing that I have to attend is Vespers at 7. So.
Okay. Well, Sam, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I kind of want to just pick up on the issue of apophaticism. You brought it up earlier when you were giving us an introduction to your icon. But, you know, obviously Dionysius is, you know, famous for his apophatic, his emphasis on apophaticism. You know, the idea being, I guess, that when it comes to speaking, the best way of speaking of God, in terms of our written or discursive theology, is through negation, through saying what God is not. Although I guess ultimately, as you know, Eric Pearl, I know you're a reader of him, he'd emphasize that even better than negation is silence.
Right. It's like it's like it's an apophaticism that also goes beyond apophaticism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that's the beauty of it, is beyond affirmation and negation, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is totally consistent with the mystical theology. I mean,
yeah, totally.
And this is a connection that you pointed out in when we were corresponding. But Dionysius actually compares the process of negation in terms of theology to sculpting, and this is a passage you pointed out to me, which is that. So this is in my translation of the mystical theologies. This is the Riordan, but he says, Dionysius says, "For it is through the removal of all from the beings, like those making a natural form statue, removing all of the hindrances that are in the way, that we may come to the pure vision of what is hidden, and by this persistent removal, the radiant manifestation of the hidden beauty itself." So, I mean, it's so interesting because it kind of suggests that bound up with Dionysius's apophaticism is actually a kind of aesthetic idea, I guess you could say, that beauty is best and most truly approached through simplification, maybe abstraction, perhaps, or a kind of
right. That's a controversial topic, because as you have, I'm sure, encountered when dealing with the Dionysian corpus, there is a tendency to interpret his work as if it's overtly conceptualizing and denying of sense experience, because he uses language that like almost, you know, if you're not reading it right, it almost seems as if he's saying forget about sense perception, you know. But we know that's not what he's saying. I mean, we come to an apprehension of divinity through sense perception itself, and he has a passage where he's talking about like he's even mentioning like we come into knowledge of him, like, you know, through imagination, which that's even more controversial. It's like, what are you talking about, imagination? You know, because you see in like the ascetic tradition, it's like there's a tendency to deprecate like the imagination as like dangerous, right? So, but also there's a positive dimension, which is like that border region that connects the sensible and the intelligible, right? In our composite, you know, makeup. So, as Saint Gregory Palamas says, so I think this is some people have, for example, in the debates concerning the icon painting revival and the theology of the icon of the 20th century, there was an anti-naturalism that was articulated in the theology of people like Fotis Cantoglou and Leonidas Ouspensky. And that became very, very prominent. And to this day, there is, you know, when people think about the icon, they think, well, it's not naturalistic like Western painting, it's more abstract, like, you know, like Eastern, you know, art. So, but the danger is to think that by default, anything that is more abstract is therefore more spiritual, you see, or, you know, or simplistically like to think that like if it's more abstract, then you are closer to the, you know, uncreated beauty, you see. And so and we know that you could get you could have something more abstract that is totally lascivious, or you could have something naturalistic that is actually very reverential, you know. And so you have to be careful with the polarizing ideologizing of, like, you know, these two aesthetic poles. Having said that, I think there is a truth to saying that naturalism, and I am of this thinking, is for us culturally at this moment, leads us to a thinking that is more an echo of our immediate sense experience. It mirrors our sense apprehensions. Okay, it's illusionism, right? It's basically it attempts to be a duplicate from what we perceive with our sense perception. Whereas a work like the Egyptian works, which Plato actually revered as standards of, like, you know, great works of art that like the Greeks should emulate because of their abiding by a traditional set of norms that had a conceptualization that was to be revered hieratically. You know, he used them as an example. You know, you have the archaic works of Greek art, which you could see that they were influenced by the Egyptian culture. So you know that kind of work, the medieval work, you know, and also Persian painting, for example, you have more of a conceptual kind of painting, more based on thought rather than sensible apprehensions. That is not to say that they don't use sensible apprehensions, but they simplify what is perceived in order to be able to communicate a concept and to lift the mind or lift the viewer beyond the everyday. Okay, and so that's where the parallel is with, I think, with Saint Dionysius, is the anagogical possibility of form. So the question is, what form accomplishes that? The problem with the 20th century icon revival theologians was that they tended to point at specific periods of the history of the icon as the standard, and they dogmatized it. They said this is the standard of what is anagogically more powerful or effective, functionally more effective, right? And so, but they went too far to the point where they created an environment where then people thought that the only thing that the icon was about was duplication of all these forms ad infinitum, because somehow they thought, that's, it's like scripture, right? The icon is like scripture, and even Ouspensky says that as scripture uses specific simplified form. You could even take it to in the Dionysian sense, where you have like the what is it, incongruous like symbols, like the and so anyway, so then Ouspensky would say then likewise, and that is like, that was through revelation, right? The writers will reveal this form that was accurate in the representation of the divine. Ouspensky would say the iconographers were illumined with this form that was appropriate for the representation of divine things and the doctrine, dogma of the gospel. And so what he created was a parallel that dogmatized a style of specific historical periods. But the fathers of the church never looked at any specific historical period, or they never spoke about specific forms as de facto or dogmatically, the only valid ones. They left it open for the discernment of the artist to come up with that. They emphasized mimesis because it was the standard way of understanding the function of an image at the time based on classical models of representation, but they never dogmatized on any specific style. So now today, the question is, or the challenge for the iconographer is, what forms actually accomplishes pictorially what Saint Dionysius describes as the functional process of the apophatic, getting rid of the unessentials, and I would say that is a process of conceptualization and simplification of form, and finding the right balance between naturalism and abstraction, not going too far into abstraction, into a Platonic kind of like intellectualism that deprecates the body and sense this reality. Neither going so far into naturalism where that's all you could think of, like the appearances of things. So the key is the Maximian notion of the logoi, like the inner principles of created beings. And so what I would contend, I have a passage that I'd like to read to you. I don't want to keep on going. I want to give other people opportunity, but this, I think, passage is important. It's from Plotinus. And he said, he's talking about how we shouldn't despise the work of the craftsman, because he says the arts, anyone who despises or dishonors the arts must know that the arts do not simply imitate what they see, but they run back to the forming principles, logoi, from which nature derives. Now, he gives an example, right? He says that, he also says, actually pertaining to beauty, which is pertinent, He says that that the craftsman also the works possess beauty. They make up what is defective in things. Okay, some people wouldn't like that, right? Because they would want to think, oh, everything that we see is the way it should be, and so there's not defective or whatever, right? But that goes back to what we were discussing before about the whole, like, the union is there, but the union is also broken. So it needs to be brought into its intended end. Okay, so the beauty that we are to be depicting is an aspiration for that eschatological beauty, right? And so now he says that for Phidias, like the famous sculptor, too, did not make his Zeus from any model perceived by the senses, which is very pertinent for iconography, right? But understood what Zeus would look like if he wanted to make himself visible, which is a very interesting idea. Okay, so now I'm gonna give you a paragraph which probably is a little bit lengthy, but I think it's important. It's an interpretation of this passage by Cornelia Sakiridou. I'm probably saying her name wrong because I'm not good in Greek, right? It's a Greek last name. She wrote an excellent book, which I recommend, called Icons in Time, Persons in Eternity, Orthodox Theology and the Aesthetics of the Christian Image, right? And she says this, which is very important. Although intelligible logoi should not be understood theoretically or abstractly, but as given in the concrete act of a thing's existence, which is the very Dionysian thing. Although she critiques Dionysius, which I don't agree with her, I've been keeping in conversation with her, and we differ in our understanding of Dionysius. But ironically, in this statement, she's actually speaking in a Dionysian way. In this case, of the sculpted Zeus. Now, logos is the living reality of a thing, not its explanation or concept. Moreover, this act is an act of self-manifestation. The art object, in this case, statue, embodies it because it has been made dynamically, vividly, through logoi, rather than through aestheses or superficial impressions. Phidias' statue does not represent Zeus and posit him as a model. It brings him to life by its own means, its own act of existence, exactly the sense of energia. Okay, that is, I think, the realm that we're dealing with. And that, in my view, it is a very complicated thing, because the problem is we're now dealing with metaphysical issues. Before, we were dealing with concrete making an icon issues, right? And so my frustration, which goes back to that article on the aesthetics of deification, is that everybody talks about beauty. Everybody talks, oh yeah, icons are supposed to be beautiful, but it's like, yes, I mean, God is beauty. I mean, we know, but it's not so simple as to say we got to go back to beauty. It's like, what beauty are you talking about? Because you're talking about an embodied thing. You're talking about the manifestation of something. But in that process of manifestation, you encounter the deception of appearances, like Plato says. And that's not, and in saying that, that's not a deprecation of appearances. It's just, we have to acknowledge that there is a component of ambiguity in beauty that we have to be careful about. And the challenge for the iconographer is to deal with how, can he accomplish what we just read, right? Tapping into the logoi, because the logoi is ultimately a manifestation, or the logoi is, as the inner principles, is they're the word that the Lord uttered in the beginning of creation, right? And so inevitably it also entails beauty, because insofar as something is, it's already beautiful, because it is in its acts of existence that it participates in beauty. And so the manifesting or capturing the logoi, the inner principle of recreated beings, is by de facto a wanting to unveil the beauty of things, as St. Dionysius is talking about, right? But this cannot be formulaically put on a table and say, you know, oh, you just paint icons like the ones in the 15th century and you're guaranteed you're going to have beautiful icons.